Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm here to review Raw Leyline Prodigy and going to give you the straight facts about where he stands in relation to Raw Izzet Viceroy, the Planeswalker that has been out for a few years now. This is the brand new Planeswalker from Puzzle Masters 2. Just hit the vault this week, and I'm going to give you what I think are some fun decks to build for him and where he stands in the Planeswalker rankings. Alright, let's do this. So, first off, thank you to Webcore, as always. Hugely appreciate the ability to be able to review these Planeswalkers before they even hit the vault, and it saves me some crystals in the long run not having to buy these, so always appreciate it. 108 hit points, not great, but not the worst. First ability, mana bonuses. They're doing the stair-stepping mana bonuses where they kind of ramp up in mana gains as you get to their colors. So red gets a +4, blue gets a +3, black +2, green +1, however no negatives, so that's something to consider. So obviously the main thing to think about is how will you get mana with this Planeswalker. Cryptics is always going to be good because that means you're always going to get 5 gems converted to red, which is the highest mana bonus. And then of course Sunken Citadel, if you like that card, will boost your mana bonuses across the board. So you will get +6 on red if you do that. So that's very nice. So you'll get 9 mana on a red match if you have Sunken Citadel out. You'll even get 6 mana on a green match, which is pretty interesting for Raw to have. So if you're playing him in a way that you're relying on gem conversion for your mana, that's not necessarily the way that I play him, but it is a viable route to go. Oh, and I should give you the deck limits as well. He gets up to 5 creatures, 9 spells, and 5 support. So he's really meant to be played with a lot of spells, right? A lot of his abilities revolve around the casting of spells. So let's get into that. Energy Redistribution, Ability 1. Discard the last card from your hand, then draw 2 cards. If a spell was discarded this way, ignite 4 gems, otherwise gain 9 mana. So the things I like about this ability, you get to basically exchange 1 card for 2, depending on what you toss. Gaining 9 mana is pretty nice, so just got to put the card that you want with the mana in the first slot, but also if you only have 1 card in your hand, you don't really get a choice. But yeah, gaining 9 mana is pretty solid. Things I don't like about this ability. You don't get to choose which cards you get to draw. So that is a knock against it compared to Raw 1's first ability where you get to fetch the card you want. And then the other thing that you may not be thinking about is if you're playing Raw, you're going to be putting a lot of spell cards in your deck. So you're likely going to only have spells to discard. So if you do that, you just ignite 4 gems. And I don't know about you, but just igniting 4 gems doesn't necessarily do a lot for you unless you have a way to take advantage of those gems igniting. I think gaining 9 mana is far superior to igniting 4 gems in most cases. Now, I will say that I don't have all of Puzzle Masters 2 yet, obviously, so maybe there's something more relevant in the set that I'm not yet thinking about because I just don't have it in my deck yet. But if you find a reason to prefer igniting 4 gems over gaining 9 mana, then great, you're going to love this ability a lot more than I did. But it is a pretty solid ability nevertheless. Unleash the Storm, Ability 2. Deal X damage to target opposing creature. X is 5 plus the number of spell cards in all graveyards. So this ability is pretty weak to be reliant on for a lot of things. And I just don't think you want to really spend loyalty on this ability unless it's a matter of life and death, because you're going to want to use his third ability as much as you can once you get it there. So spending your loyalty on this and then having to rebuild your loyalty to get to his third is just not very efficient to me. And a lot of times it's not going to do enough damage to really be worth it. So I didn't find this to be that useful of an ability when I was playing around with it, but it will help with some creature damage objectives, so that's fine for that reason. And then his third ability, I think, is where his power lies, really. Storm Mage Masterpiece. Create 4 electrostatic accumulator tokens. And what are those? A support card, 4 shields. It is an artifact, and it's colorless. So if you have any card you're using that relies on artifact cards gaining shields or having a lot of shields on it, or any support really, like Commodore Guff, it's a pretty big support card. It comes to the board, at least at level 60, with 16 shields on it. So, when you cast a non-copy spell, deal X damage to your opponent, then the support loses 1 shield. So what you really want to do is when you create this support, have a lot of spells charged up and ready to go, or have a means to create loops that will enable you to cast a lot of spells from it. So you can win pretty quickly with this ability. So in that regard, he has an advantage over Raw 1, but it doesn't draw any cards for you. It really is reliant on everything in your deck being set up to win with this one, but it's not really a self-propelling engine like Raw 1's third ability is. So it's definitely got some pros there, but it also has a bit of a con as well in that regard. And then the more spells you cast, the less effective the support is. So if you're toward the end of the game or you're nearing the end of it and you just really need to win, you got a lot of spells ready to go, then this ability is great. And let's talk about his passive now. Leyline Optimization. When you cast a spell card, gain 1 loyalty. Pretty straightforward, pretty solid. I personally feel that I didn't rely a lot on his passive ability to get me a lot of loyalty. I had a few other things going on in my deck that gained me loyalty quicker, but it's not nothing. It can build up your loyalty in a way that you don't even really think about. It's not that crazy that you're just going to be gaining tons of loyalty every turn, because if you have the ability to cast that many spell cards, it probably doesn't even matter at that point. You're probably in such control of the match that gaining 1 loyalty is so incidental to your strategy at that point that it won't do a lot for you. But maybe in the early game, when you're just casting spells to build up your loyalty, this could help. It's definitely a cool passive. It just wasn't as amazing as I thought it would be when I first read it. But it's cool. Definitely something worth remembering. Alright, so here are the pros for him. It is a solid color combo. Red and blue is pretty good. And his abilities go well with the whole Izzet theme. He is definitely a Spellslinger type. A potentially very strong finisher in his third ability, and his passive ability has the potential to gain you a lot of loyalty. His cons, though. His first ability is only truly useful when you discard a non-spell, which may not be readily available. So I covered that in more detail just before. And then there's not enough built-in draw in his kit. So cards like Days Undoing, any card that can fill up your hand with mana, Blade Coil, any other card that can fill up your hand with cards will help get things going. I don't think his kit is as self-sustaining as Raw 1's is, so you do have to build a little bit more for him. He's not as ready to go right out the box as Raw is, I think. So, now I've shown you his abilities here. Let's get into some decks that I think are pretty strong for him. Okay, so this deck here is mainly built around getting benefits from drawing a lot and discarding a lot. So we got first Steam Core Scholar, the king of gaining utility from drawing cards, because gaining that X mana and X loyalty at the end of your turn X's this card's level, and you draw a card during your turn to increase its level by 1. So if you're doing that a lot, you're going to have a pretty solid way to get lots of mana and loyalty at the end of every turn of yours. So really like this card, especially for this deck. Got a few different ones. Duelist of the Mind, Human Advisor. Whenever you draw a card, this creature gets +1/+0. So you're getting some mana there. But really the interesting part of this card is when you commit a crime, discard your hand, then draw 5 cards. This effect can trigger up to 2 times per turn. You cast this card and you commit a crime, so you're already drawing 5 cards there. So he becomes a 6/3 right off the bat. For 8 mana, not bad, but we're really doing it so that we can continue to draw cards no matter where we are in our turn. And then Psychic Frog is a new PM2 card. It's a creature, 1/2 for 7 mana. When this creature deals combat damage, draw a card. That's relevant for later, but when you discard a card from your hand, this creature gets +2/+2. So this creature should be getting to a decent size when you run through your cycle of cards played. And we got a bunch of other things that will help us do that. Let's look at Cut Your Losses. Destroy the top 10 cards of your opponent's library and convert 10 gems to blue. You know what Cut Your Losses does. It's there to convert gems and get lots of mana. Rite of Flame. This card works pretty well. Sometimes this card, if you don't have enough room in your hand to gain mana, it'll sit dead in your hand. But with all the cards that we'll be discarding, this shouldn't be a problem. First card in your hand that is not named Rite of Flame gains 6 mana, then ignite 2 red gems. Threshold to ignite 3 red gems instead, and that card gains 8 mana instead. So the more of these you put in the grave, the better it gets. But Rite of Flame is always a solid card to go with. Brass's Tunnel Grinder. If you watch Gauze's videos, you know that this is a very solid card. When this support enters the board, discard all cards without mana from your hand. Then draw that many cards +1, and those cards gain 2 mana for each of the support shields. So if you first play, Duelist of the Mind or Steam Core Scholar, you're going to end up with a bunch of cards without mana in your hand. Then you play Brass's Tunnel Grinder, and then those cards are going to be gaining mana. So they gain 2 mana for each of the support shields. Usually that means you're going to be putting 6 mana into all cards that you draw there. At the end of combat on your turn, if you match 1 or more support gems, increase this card's level by 2. And at the beginning of your turn, if this card's level is 2 or more, you transform this card. Then it becomes a solid land for conversion. At the beginning of your turn, convert 5 gems to one of the colors of your greatest mana bonuses. Then if the last card in your hand has full mana, discover 4. I wish this was at the end of your turn if this card's level is 2 or more to transform this card, because when it transforms, it doesn't start converting mana for you until the next turn. So if this happened at the end of the turn you played it, and then it flipped, and it was a land for you next turn, that'd be so much better. But still a good card for what it is. And then Lock and Load is great because you're going to be discarding your entire hand and then drawing 4 cards, and the last 2 cards in your hand gain full mana. So not only will we be pumping up our creatures from all that draw, but then we're likely going to be able to play something really good when we cast Lock and Load. And if we Lock and Load and cast into a Brass's Tunnel Grinder, those 2 cards that didn't gain mana get 6 mana from that. So really cool synergy there. Ichor Moon Gauntlet is here to gain us more loyalty and to gain us extra swaps when we use our abilities. Duretti Ingenious Iconoclast, just solid removal. Comes to the board with 5 shields. This -1, destroy target creature. Then if that card is an artifact, create 3 gold tokens. So pretty much just targeted removal every turn for when you need it there. Helps out a lot. And then stolen goods to take care of supports that they might be throwing out there for you. Create a copy of all opposing non-token supports on the board under your control. And then return all opposing non-token cards to their owner's hand. So not only is it stealing your opponent's supports, but it's basically wiping your opponent as well. So very strong card. It is dependent on your opponent playing non-token supports. So there's probably ways to make this more of a combo piece in order to force your opponent to put non-token supports on the board. There are a couple ways, but I haven't really explored them. Seems a little bit janky for something to rely on, but still very good card in a lot of instances. So that is why that card is in this deck. And so yeah, I hope you enjoyed watching this deck do its thing. It's not going to be everybody's cup of tea, but it is pretty fun and fairly unique. Okay, so this deck is mainly just built around throwing a bunch of spells at your opponent after you get his third ability on the board and going through and wrecking your opponent that way. So we got Arcane Bombardment. When you cast a spell card, exile a random spell card from your graveyard, then create a copy of X spells at random from your exile into your hand. Those copies gain full mana. X is this card's level, then increase this card's level by 1. This effect can trigger only once per turn. So the interesting thing about this card is that even though his third ability doesn't work off of copied spells, you can get a lot of spells into your hand just by virtue of using cards like Hit the Motherlode, Days Undoing, Broker's Charm, using a Cut Your Losses to get that card going. And it can loop a little bit. The way it can do that is if you create a lot of gold tokens and stuff for Hit the Motherlode and you draw a lot of cards or put new cards in your hand with Hit the Motherlode or Broker's Charm, you play a Volcanic Rambler and you destroy a bunch of gold tokens, putting a bunch of more mana into your hand that you can then use to play out other spells too. And then Manaform Hellkite is there to create a win con, an alternate win con, even if you're not doing a bunch of damage with your copied spells. With its third ability, Manaform Hellkite will take advantage of all the cards you're casting and pump up your dragon illusion token that way. So there's a decent amount of synergy. Even though Arcane Bombardment only works once a turn, you can usually get a lot of spells in your hand full of mana that will then get you more non-copy spells, and that should make a lot of damage to build up with his third ability. So Rakdos, Patron of Chaos, is going to be our main removal engine here. But, you know, we got Broker's Charm and Molten Collapse for anything else that we need to get rid of before anything else happens. And then Days Undoing, of course, is going to put a bunch of new spells and other cards into our hand, which then, if we play a Volcanic Rambler, we can destroy a bunch of gold tokens and start to play our new cards in that way. So it's a decent amount of synergy happening here. Broker's Charm and Hit the Motherlode, of course, Days Undoing, are going to be getting us a lot of cards in our hand. I think Days Undoing is a pretty important card to have with Raw because he doesn't have a lot of his own card draw built in like Raw 1 does. So you're going to want to have a lot of ways to keep your hand full. Arcane Bombardment will work with that. It's usually not a bad idea to keep one spell in your hand charged for the next turn so that you can trigger another Arcane Bombardment. So yeah, there's a couple different ways to win with this deck. You can just either work a lot to make a lot of damage happen with Rawl's third ability, or you can just build up the Dragon Illusion token that Manaform Hellkite creates. So if you're not yet familiar with Manaform Hellkite, pretty old card at this point, but the Dragon Illusion token It's a token with flying and haste. When this creature enters the battlefield, it gets +X/+X. X is equal to the base cost of the last spell or support card in your graveyard. And at the end of your turn, exile this token. So we're going to be putting a lot of things into our graveyard just by casting a bunch of spells. So you can build them up a decent amount just with normal gameplay. The only thing I'll say about this deck is it can sometimes take a little bit of time to get going. If you don't draw into like a cut your losses or something like that, you might have to rely on Rawl's first ability to get you some mana there. And you may end up having to toss out a card that you want to use for later. But once things get going, you're in a pretty good position. So that's what I got to say about this deck. And let's move on to the next one. Alright, so obviously I was not going to leave a Raw review without just straight up looping deck, right? So this one isn't really built on anything that is supposed to just loop infinitely. It just kind of does a pretty good amount of looping just by the fact that it can cast a lot of cards fairly easily. Not until you get to the very end of Urabrask's Saga is when it actually starts to just loop and create a bunch of spells with full mana for you. So let's go straight to this card here and talk about it. Urabrask, Phyrexian Praetor. When you cast a spell card, deal 2 damage to your opponent's Planeswalker and gain 4 mana. Increase this card's level by 1. At the beginning of your turn, if this card's level is 3 or less, this card's level becomes 1. Otherwise, exile this card, create the Great Work token. So basically what that's saying is, in order to get this guy to flip into its Saga, you need to cast 4 or more spell cards in a turn. And when you do that, you get this Great Work token. Deal 3 damage to each opposing creature. Deal 3 damage to each opposing creature for each of their reinforcements. Deal 6 damage to your opponent's Planeswalker. So that's Chapter 1. Chapter 2, you create 5 gold tokens. Chapter 3, return the first 3 spell cards from your graveyard to your hand. Return the first 3 spell cards from your opponent's graveyard to your hand. Spell cards in your hand gain 3 mana and outcast. Return the first card named Urabrask from your exile to the battlefield under your control. So that seems like those are all just okay chapters. And they are, except when you pair it with Inexorable Tide. Because when you cast a card, you proliferate. And when you proliferate, you read the next chapter of each saga you control. So every time you cast a card, you're going to be returning the first 3 spell cards from your graveyard to your hand. And then all the spell cards in your hand are going to gain 3 mana and outcast. So as long as you have like a cheap spell, say a Cut Your Losses, something like that, a Temporal Mastery, as long as you keep casting that, you're just going to be putting a bunch of spells into your hand. They're going to be gaining 3 mana every time you cast another card. That's going to be building up all the mana in your hand for your spells. So that's great. And then we have all these different ways of getting mana into our hand. We got Hit the Mother Lode. When you cast this card, discover 4, then discover 4, and then create 4 gold tokens. What a great card. Just one of my favorites in Standard right now. And then, obviously, if you don't know what discover 4 even means, you pick one of the first 4 cards from your library and you fetch that card. That card gains half its mana rounded down. Follow the bodies. We're going to be investigating by creating a bunch of simple tokens, aka gold tokens. And then we're going to be collecting that evidence. Going to be drawing 3 cards. Each card in your hand gains half its mana rounded down. So that's going to be a crucial part to making our deck really go. This is a new Vanguard, and I use it for its -2. Chandra Hope's Beacon. Spell cards in your hand gain 6 mana. So if you get a lot of spell cards in your hand to start with, just hit that -2, and you're likely going to be able to put all the rest of the mana you need in your hand to cast those spells. Sten, Paranoid Partisan. When this creature enters the battlefield, reduce the cost of all cards in your hand by 3. So that's going to make our cards even cheaper. Temporal Mastery. I like having Temporal Mastery in here because it just gains us an extra swap. And as we go through the normal course of our gameplay, we're going to be gaining our loyalty. And then we're going to want to use his third ability as often as we can, over and over again. And if we have Temporal Mastery in there, we can get a bunch of cards in our hand, bunch of spells fully loaded, wait till our first swap phase runs out. We use the time in between the extra swaps to trigger his third ability, and then just go off and really start to whittle our opponent down with all the spells we're going to be tossing out at him. Blade Coil Serpent. I hope you didn't forget about this guy. When this creature enters the battlefield, draw X cards. Those cards gain X mana. X is equal to half the number of blue gems on the board, rounded down. So if we're doing a lot of cut your losses, that's going to be giving us a decent amount of blue gems on the board. So we're going to be putting a lot of mana into the cards that we gain from casting the Serpent. And then, of course, there's the added benefit of your opponent discarding Y cards. Y is equal to half the number of black gems on the board, rounded down. So you have to hit a black gem somewhere in there, but it's usually not that hard to do. So there's a lot happening in this deck. It's really fun. It's probably my favorite of the 3 that I just shared with you. So have fun with it if you can build it. I know it's a lot of masterpieces and mythics in here, but definitely one worth trying to create if you can. And for me, it's definitely a main loop type of deck. All right, let's move on to our final grades. And I got something interesting for you there. Okay, at this point, you might be wondering, why would I choose Raw Leyline Prodigy over Raw Izzet Viceroy? And you're thinking, which one should I pick up? Well, let's break them down together. I think this will give you a good idea as to where you want to spend your resources in. So let's break it down one by one. We got max hit points. C+ for Raw Leyline Prodigy. 108 is fine, but not great. And Raw Izzet Viceroy only has 102, so that's a little less. So I gotta knock him down a little bit. I think that's the worst part about Raw Izzet Viceroy. He just doesn't have a lot of hit points, which if you get off to a bad start can hurt you a bit. Mana spread. You know, a lot of people are liking this new way that they have been giving us the Planeswalkers, that it kind of ramps up into the highest mana gains. I personally prefer having 2 strong colors where we get like a +5 on color matches, but that's me. I don't mind having the negative mana bonuses because I'm just going to build for gaining on color matches. So I'd just rather have that myself. So I'm giving Raw Leyline Prodigy a B+. I think B+ is the most that I can give a Planeswalker that has this mana spread. For Raw, I give him an A because, yeah, he just gets more on color matches, and he has a decent amount that you get from even some of his off-color matches too. I think it's only green that he gets like a -2 on, which is not good. But for the most part, you can avoid having to deal with a lot of green matches available. So there we go. Ability 1. I give Raw Leyline Prodigy's first ability a B because it can be good to get 9 mana from a loyalty ability, but it is very dependent on having the right things in your deck to do so. Whereas with Raw Izzet Viceroy, he's got one of the best first abilities in the game, and I think it's a lot of the reason people like to use it, because you can choose one of the next 4 cards in your library, give it 6 mana. 6 is a little less than 9, of course, but you get to choose which one you're getting, You don't lose any cards for doing so, and it doesn't matter which type of card you pick, it's always going to get 6 mana. And then it also helps to put more things into your graveyard. You're putting 3 things into your graveyard instead of just 1. So there's just so much utility you get out of it, and it really is great. So there's that. Second ability. I think Leyline Prodigy's second ability is just underpowered, really. It's fine for certain objectives, I guess, but even so, you usually want to do more than what you get from using this ability to a creature. So it gets a B minus for me. Raw Izzet Viceroy. His second ability gets an A minus for me. It's definitely the ability of his that I use the least. It comes in handy at certain points in time. I mostly use it to fulfill creature damage objectives. I think it is just a much better ability because you also get mana from it. You get to put mana into one of your spells in your hand. So you usually will give it enough mana to be able to cast it. So you get a lot out of using this ability. Much more so than you do with raw Leyline Prodigy, I think. Ability 3. This is where raw Leyline Prodigy makes up a lot of ground. It is a pretty good ability, but it does have some downsides. It only works on non-copy spells, so you can't really double up on the damage when you use things like Arcane Bombardment, but it can be very strong when you have spells loaded up to go. That's the only thing. You need to have spells loaded up and ready to go, or a way to get a lot of spells into your hand continuously. So I give it an A. It is very strong, and it can be pretty fun to use. His third ability is S tier to me, because even though it's slower and you do need to do a lot of clicking to keep it going, it is a lot more self-sustaining, because if you can draw 2 cards every time you cast a spell, if the spell that you casted gains you mana, then you can put that mana into those next 2 cards that you draw. So that is why this ability is so good. It is good in the fact that you can just win with it by the damage you do, but it's also a draw engine. So it's very much, when built properly for it, a very self-sustaining win con there. So really great ability. It's passive. So obviously Raw Izzet Viceroy does not have a passive ability, but Raw Leyline Prodigy does. And I give it an A, because even though it's not usually that amazing, it definitely helps to do some things for you as you go. And so if you're in a battle and you just get the right wave going and you are able to cast a lot of spells even before you hit his third ability, this will get you there pretty fast. And of course, not applicable to Raw Izzet Viceroy. Versatility. I think since they're both spell slinging types of planeswalkers, you're going to want to use them for that. So I think they can both be versatile. I just don't think a lot of people use this plane. I don't think a lot of people use either planeswalker without spells in mind. So it kind of inspires you to go a certain route, even though you don't necessarily have to. But when you go with the spell slinging route, I think that they're both very good at it. So I give Raw Leyline Prodigy B plus in versatility, because you do want to build for his abilities. It takes a little bit more extra thought than it would for Raw Izzet Viceroy to get the most out of his abilities. So, whereas with Raw Izzet Viceroy, I give him just a leg up in versatility, because I think it's easier to do a few more strategies with them, like graveyard, recursion, or just anything that takes advantage of having cards in your graveyard. So that's why I go with an A minus for him. Card utility. So they both do really well with spells, if that is the type of deck that you like to build. They both do a great job with it. I give Raw an A for card utility, because if you do put a lot of spells into his deck and that's what you're going for, then he's going to do a really good job and he has a good win con to go with it. So I do think that Raw Izzet Viceroy is a little bit better at handling the cards, because you just get more out of his abilities with the same cards. If you build the same type of decks for them, they both run them very well, but I think Raw Izzet Viceroy is just a little bit better at maximizing the utility of those cards. And now fun. Raw Leyline Prodigy gets an A minus for me. If you are the type of player that loves spell slinging, the whole red and blue color combo is exciting for you, building looping decks, slinging spells, all that jazz, he does it very well. But Raw Izzet Viceroy, I think, is a little bit more fun for me personally, because I like his mana gains a little bit more. I feel like I get more out of his abilities just overall. And, even though his third ability is, I think, overall more useful, I think it's a little less fun to have to keep clicking over and over again, whereas Raw Leyline Prodigy, you just cast a spell and it does what you want it to do for you, without having to do any extra clicking around. So I think they're pretty close to being on par with the amount of fun you can have with them. And now, the final grades. I give Leyline Prodigy an A minus. Very solid walker. Definitely one worth picking up, especially for crystals. But Raw Izzet Viceroy is an A plus, and he has been and will remain one of the best planeswalkers in the game. And no newcomer is going to take that away from him. At the end of the day, I think if you have to choose one or the other, pick up Raw Izzet Viceroy. However, if you have Raw Izzet Viceroy and you already love that play style that he affords you, and none of the other red and blue planeswalkers are really doing it for you, you just want another Spellslinger in red and blue, Raw Leyline Prodigy is definitely a no-brainer pickup for you. It just comes down to, for me, I would pick up Raw Izzet Viceroy first. If you've been using Raw 1 for a long time, he's one of your favorites out there. Raw Leyline Prodigy kind of almost is an expansion pack for him. They're going to be right next to each other, so it's almost like having one planeswalker spread out across two different planeswalkers. It's kind of interesting. It's almost like this is the web core take on Raw Izzet Viceroy. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this review and it was useful for you. I look forward to seeing what people can do with him, especially as more and more people get PM2 cards. I think there is a lot more to be learned about when there are more of those out in the wild and we see more creativity come from it. All right. I can't wait to get into my next Planeswalker review, and make sure you're subscribed. Maybe consider turning on notifications for this channel so you don't miss the next time I put out a video. And until then, have fun.